Hi everyone! Tonight's video is an introduction to carbon chemistry for high school biology students. We are a carbon-based life form. All the molecules that make up our cells have a carbon skeleton. So I've got a picture here of a fatty acid, and you can see all of these carbons in the middle of the molecule. We call that the carbon skeleton. The large carbon-based molecules are organic molecules. To be considered an organic molecule, the molecule must contain carbon, be found in or made by living systems, and it has to have at least one carbon-hydrogen bond. That means that carbon dioxide is not considered an organic molecule because it does not have one carbon-hydrogen bond. So why carbon? Well, carbon has 4 valence electrons. What does that mean? That means each carbon can form 4 bonds. It can bond to 4 other atoms. That makes it a really great building block. Cells can make large molecules, macromolecules, using carbon as the central atom of the skeleton. If your central atom could only bind to 2 things, you couldn't make very large molecules. So if you look again at our fatty acid, you can see each of these carbons has 4 bonds around it. And so that's because it has 4 valence electrons. Some other carbon facts that you should know. Carbon is a nonmetal. That means it lives up in the upper right-hand corner of the periodic table. And it forms covalent bonds with other nonmetals. Let's review some bond types from chemistry. First of all, let's look at ionic bonding. And ionic bonding is between a metal and a non-metal. And the more electronegative element, in this case the non-metal, steals an electron from the less electronegative element, that's the metal. And that gives the metal a positive charge and the non-metal a negative charge. These charged ions then form an ionic bond due to the attraction of the positively charged metal and the negatively charged non-metal. Hydrogen bonds are actually misnamed. It should be called a hydrogen interaction because it's not as strong as a bond, but I'm going to go ahead and use the common terminology of hydrogen bond. And a hydrogen bond is when a hydrogen is bound to a very electronegative element, like nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. What this very electronegative element does is it kind of takes more than its share of the electrons in this bond. The electrons spend more of their time near the oxygen than they do near the hydrogen. That gives the hydrogen a partial positive charge. It's not a full positive charge, but because the electrons aren't in this neighborhood as often, it has more of a positive-ish charge. And that's true for each of the hydrogens bound to a very electronegative element like oxygen. Because the electrons are spending more time in the neighborhood of the oxygen has a partial negative charge. Again, it's not a full negative charge. But when you have a partial negative charge near a partial positive charge, what you get is this hydrogen interaction. It's not as strong as an ionic bond between a full positive and a full negative, but you get a partial bond forming here, or a hydrogen bond forming due to the partial positive and negative of these elements in this hydrogen bond. The last type of bond you should remember is a covalent bond. And these are between 2 nonmetals, and it's when electrons are shared between the 2 nonmetals so that each of them has a full octet of electrons in their outer shell. And so this sharing is what gives a very, very strong bond. What are some of the other elements found in the molecules of life other than carbon? Well, there's nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are all nonmetals, and they all form covalent bonds with carbon. Again, that's where the electrons are shared between the nonmetal elements. Not all covalent bonds, however, are the same, because some covalent bonds are polar. And in a polar bond, the electrons spend more time with one element than another. And my example here is in a water molecule, where the electrons, again, will spend more time with the oxygen than they will with the hydrogen. These electrons, because they're not shared equally, gives a partial negative charge in one end of the molecule and a partial positive charge in the other end of the molecule. Some covalent bonds are nonpolar. In a nonpolar bond, the electrons are shared equally, so there's an equal charge distribution around the bonds. And an example here is methane, where you have all carbon-hydrogen bonds. These electrons are shared very evenly between all the carbons and hydrogens in this molecule. It's very important for you to know that carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds are always nonpolar. Whenever you see those bonds, they are nonpolar bonds. The charges are distributed very evenly. Why all the emphasis on polar versus nonpolar bonds? Well, molecules with polar bonds behave very differently than molecules with nonpolar bonds in biological systems. Biological cells are called aqueous. That means they're water-based. Is water polar or nonpolar? You should all be jumping up and down and saying water is very polar. What happens to polar molecules when they're placed in polar solutions, such as water? They dissolve. What happens to nonpolar molecules when they're placed in polar solutions, such as water? They do not dissolve. If you were building a cell, what type of molecule would you use? Would you use a polar or a nonpolar molecule to form the edge or the barrier of the cell? I would use a nonpolar molecule because a nonpolar molecule doesn't dissolve in water. That means the edge doesn't dissolve in the interior of the cell. You can see I've shown here a plastic bag. A plastic bag is a very good way to store an aqueous solution because the plastic doesn't dissolve in the water. If you had a polar molecule as the edge of your cell or the edge of your container, such as this paper bag, what happens is the paper eventually dissolves in the water, and then the water would leak out of your bag, or in this case, it would leak out of your cell. What you should know from tonight's video: you should know the definition of an organic molecule. You should know why carbon is a good central atom for building large macromolecules. You should review the 3 types of bonds presented in this video. And you should know what type of bond carbon forms with other nonmetals. You should also know the difference between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds. And you should specifically know that carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds are nonpolar bonds. You should also understand why it matters to a cell if a molecule is polar or nonpolar. So that's all for tonight.